Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to this meeting of the Healthier Communities and Older People Overview and Scrutiny panel. Item 1 is apologies for absence. Do we have any apologies for absence?
Yeah, we've had apologies for absence from Celine Chaput, member, from Councillor Rebecca Lanning, who's being substituted by Councillor Joan Henry, and Councillor Thomas Ward, who's being substituted by Councillor Una Moulton.
Thomas Barlow.
Sorry, Thomas Barlow.
Sorry, I missed that bit. Can you, I certainly welcome Joan and Una to the meeting. Joan, you're here in place of Rebecca Lanning, and Una, you're here in place of
Thomas Barlow.
Okay, welcome to you both. Are there any other apologies? Okay, item 2 is declarations of pecuniary interest. Are there any declarations?
Nope.
Okay, item 3 is the minutes of the previous meeting. Are they agreed?
Agreed. Agreed.
Doing very well. Item 4 is the update on COVID-19 from NHS West London CCG. And I believe that's James who's going to talk us through that. Welcome, James.
Thank you very much, Councillor.
Introduce this briefly and give plenty of opportunity for people to ask questions.
Certainly. My name's James Blythe. I'm the Locality Director for Merton and Wandsworth at South West London CCG. So for those not familiar with the role, my job is to lead the local team that supports commissioning of services in Merton and Wandsworth, and indeed has done much of our work both with NHS providers and also working across other partners during the COVID pandemic in order to maintain and recently recover NHS funded services. So just a little bit of background in terms of sort of what happened really and what our sort of organisational response was during COVID. So when the pandemic started, NHS England, so that's the national body that oversees organisations such as mine, declared a level 4 incident nationally, and this effectively meant that the whole NHS went into a command and control model. So legally, many of the duties and the functions of the CCG and other local bodies were effectively subsumed to NHS England. So legally, we've all sort of been working as part of the Department of Health and Social Care in a fairly sort of command and control structure really since the start of the pandemic. What that meant for us in practical terms in South West London is we established an incident control room, which was staffed 7 days a week during the height of the pandemic. And we were in daily communication upwards, regionally and nationally, and then outwards to all of our providers and other partners as well. So effectively, as I say, there was a sort of a command and control structure that was quite different than the normal way we work. Now, although we've stood down some of the sort of the 12 hours a day, 7 days a week, having a room staffed with people on daily calls with NHS England, we do to a certain extent remain in a sort of command and control structure. So we are subject to national instructions and guidance from NHS England. We are working in a very coordinated way across the health system in South West London and also with health and care partners. And so it's been quite a change really for the CCG in terms of we're not doing the things that we would normally be doing at about this time of year, and our focus until recently has been on COVID. Our focus increasingly now is dual. It's on being prepared for future local outbreaks or a general second wave of COVID, but also on recovery from the pandemic, from the impacts of the pandemic on the NHS and on service users more generally who saw changes to their services during the pandemic. So, as I say, the focus of the system now is on that return and recovery to normal levels of healthcare services for non-COVID patients, on preparing for winter and the pressures and demands that that will bring, not least the largest flu vaccination campaign that the NHS has ever delivered. One of the things that we are doing at the same time is ensuring wherever possible that we embed the learning from all of our work and experiences during COVID, because whilst it's been an enormous challenge for the NHS and indeed for the whole of society, equally COVID has fostered remarkable innovation in a number of areas, and we are keen to make sure that that learning is not lost in the way that we restart services. I think the final thing that I would say in terms of an overall priority is that there is a huge focus for the NHS locally, regionally and nationally on health inequalities, making sure that we work actively to tackle health inequalities, and particularly making sure that the way that we restart NHS funded services does not worsen health inequalities. And there are a couple of particular challenges about that I'll draw reference to. So we now have a recovery programme across South West London, which is taking forward the various aspects of recovering NHS services in the context of COVID. And that's really wide ranging, because it's really about everything in health and NHS funded services, but it's also about the links into social care, education and public health as well, and indeed into our communities. I mean, just to highlight some of the recovery activities that are taking place, I think it will be of particular interest to the committee. We have a programme of work around planned care, and that programme of work is addressing the fact that many planned care services were completely paused during the height of the pandemic. So most elective operating was paused unless it was a case that required very, very urgent life-saving surgery. Most surgery was deferred. So that means that there is a considerable backlog of surgery that now needs to take place. That's a challenge across the NHS. But that surgery has to take place in a context where we have different standards around infection prevention and control. So we need to keep patients who are accessing that surgery in environments and pathways which are COVID safe wherever practically possible. So that has real impacts on things like how theatres are used, how wards are used, and also how diagnostic equipment is used. So wherever practicable, we have diagnostic equipment that is used for patients who may have COVID, and we have separate diagnostic equipment used for patients who have been swabbed and confirmed or at low risk of having COVID. And so those are the sorts of measures that, following national guidance, we are taking in order to keep people who are accessing some of those restarted services safe. We're also doing this on a South West London basis to look at our waiting lists, to look at how we prioritise patients to get back into surgical services, and to make sure that wherever possible we're providing an equitable and a consistent service on a South West London basis, and that, you know, where there are opportunities to get patients into services more quickly by the use of a hospital other than their local one, or by the use of independent sector capacity, which is largely in South West London contracted to the NHS still at this point, that we are taking those opportunities because it's important that people receive timely care when they have been referred in for services. So that is a huge piece of work. There are 12 clinical networks for the major specialties, and they are led by GPs and secondary care consultants from across South West London, looking at the waiting list, looking at the prioritisation of services for each of those specialties, to make sure that we do that in the best possible way, and that we make use of the available capacity. We are also making sure that we are as prepared as possible for in terms of intensive care for a second wave. So intensive care performed very well in South West London during the first wave. There was an intensive care bed for everyone for whom it was clinically appropriate and who needed that level of care. That meant that we basically tripled our intensive care capacity at the height of the pandemic across South West London. The work that we are doing is to say, if there was a local outbreak or a generalised second wave, how would we do that? But equally, how could we continue to do that, but also maintain some capacity to continue to treat some of those elective patients who might need intensive care, but need it on a COVID safe, what we call the green pathway. and specifically, are there changes in terms of where critical care capacity needs to be? And we're working in particular with St George's to look at how we increase some of their critical care capacity, both in the short term for this winter, but also in the medium term, to reflect on some of the learnings from COVID, and to also use some money that's been made available from the centre for us to do that. Another area that I think is worth highlighting, and this is particularly important in terms of messaging out to communities, around cancer. So one of the things that happened during COVID was that referrals for signs and symptoms of cancer dropped significantly by about 80% at the very peak of the pandemic. This means that there are people who would normally have been referred to on what we call 2-week rule pathway to assess whether they have cancer or not, who were not referred during that time, and we have started to see some of those patients presenting at A&E in particular with more advanced signs and symptoms of cancer. So the first thing is that we need to make sure that everyone who has signs and symptoms that might indicate cancer does go and see their GP, whether remotely or in person as appropriate. Those pathways are open for referral. But what we are now doing is making sure that, working with the Royal Marsden partners, that's our Cancer Alliance, that we get everyone treated as quickly as possible who has cancer, and that we get everyone seen and diagnosed who may have cancer, and that we create the capacity for what we're now seeing in some specialties, which is that we are seeing referrals at 130, 140% of levels that we saw last year. As more people are coming forwards who had signs and symptoms and didn't present earlier, we are seeing a bit of a bump come through, a bit of a wave come through. So that's a key focus. We are working really closely with Mental Health Trust around mental health recovery, and indeed there was a summit in July, an online summit that was held by the Mental Health Trust, to make sure that we were tackling not just some backlogs in mental health care that had emerged when it wasn't safe to treat some people during COVID, but also to anticipate that there will be increased mental health challenges that result from the societal impacts really of COVID. And we're talking about economic hardship, recession, unemployment, etc. So in particular, there is increased investment going into psychological therapy services, both online and face-to-face, to make sure that we deal with an accumulated backlog during COVID, but also that we have the capacity in place to support people, and also support people through community networks to tackle some of those challenges that they're facing. The final area that I will focus on, where we've got significant work going on, is around primary care as well. So the COVID has been a huge challenge for primary care, but it's also been one of the greatest sources of innovation. So we were talking to primary care about more digital access pre-COVID, and digital access is now a significant feature of primary care. In order to get people seen by GPs and to get people GP consultations whilst keeping people safe, and whilst also keeping our GP workforce safe, online and digital consultations will be a significant feature of general practice for the foreseeable future. But it's important that that's done in a robust and appropriate way. And it's also important that practices are supported to restart face-to-face services where that's appropriate for patients as well. So we're making sure that's done consistently. The challenge for general practice is that, obviously you will know that we have general practice on very different scales. So even within an area such as Mitcham and Pollard's Hill, you have some practices with 4,000 patients and some practices with 20,000 patients. And clearly workforce challenges are significant for practices with 4,000 patients if they have a number of staff who may have vulnerabilities to COVID-19. So we're working really closely with the practices to make sure that they are able to support their communities, to make sure that they're able to provide access to services. And in some cases during the pandemic, that meant practices working together in larger networks to make sure that access was provided, particularly for patients who were presenting with COVID signs and symptoms. I think that there'll be an element of that going forward in terms of business as usual, but also that will be how we will address a local outbreak or a second wave. Will be to know how we will escalate and make sure that there's resilient access to services, even if there are individual practices who are struggling. And a key part of that resilience is making sure that the primary care workforce is well, and to make sure that primary care is supported to follow infection prevention and control guidance so that staff and patients are kept safe. We also have been working really closely with local providers around post-COVID rehab. So this is probably the final thing that I'll highlight. So we have had a service operating out of St George's. This has been following up patients post-acute admission, has recalled a number of patients for pulmonary function testing, CT, and chest x-ray where necessary, and has made a number of referrals into a wide range of services. Sometimes it's the obvious ones, things like respiratory physiotherapy. Sometimes it's actually referral into mental health services post-COVID because of the impact that the long-term signs and symptoms and rehabilitation from COVID can have on people, which is something that I think as nationally and internationally we are still understanding. So a huge amount going on. I hope I haven't taken up too much time with that sort of brief canter through it, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Well, I was about to sort of remind you about my introductory comments, James, but you just about got in within my threshold of tolerance for an introduction. The reason I was keen for you to make it brief was so that members would have the opportunity to ask their questions. So are there any questions? Jennifer.
Thank you very much. That was very interesting and informative. Can I just ask, what indirect impact has COVID had to children on preventative health care, such as on local missed vaccinations? Thank you.
Yeah, so we have seen some impact from that. I don't have sort of precise numbers to hand in terms of how many children have missed vaccinations, but we have seen an impact in primary care in terms of that being a factor. So we're working really closely with primary care to make sure that there are catch-up measures in place so that we can, so that practices are proactively contacting children, well, families particularly, to get children in to ensure that vaccinations take place. A number of children will also be vaccinated as part of what will be a very substantial flu vaccination campaign as well this year. So that is an opportunity as well for us to get those children in. I would say that there have been other impacts on children as well. So clearly, where there are children with vulnerabilities or complex needs, those children pre-COVID would have been in frequent contact with perhaps social care, education and healthcare services, and some of those contacts have fallen away during the height of the pandemic, when there was a redirection of resources into other services, and additionally it wasn't safe for some services to continue. So one of the things that we're working really closely with council colleagues around is to make sure that we've got appropriate support in around safeguarding, that the restart of community services identifies where there might be specific challenges. And we're also working really closely, for example, with the schools to make sure that we're supporting the schools to restart safely as well. So yes, absolutely. I think one of the real challenges around COVID has been less the challenge for so the challenge for people who were at risk of or acquired COVID was clearly absolutely immense. And we should note that, you know, there are areas of Merton where there was a really significant impact from COVID that related to underlying risk factors within communities. But equally, I think that a large part of recovery is also about focusing on people who weren't directly affected by COVID, but were affected by the way that health and care services needed to change to respond to COVID. And certainly children are in that group.
Una. You need to unmute.
There. Can you hear me all right?
We can hear you now.
I just wanted to say thank you for that very informative intro. A couple of questions. Firstly, relating to the flu vaccination programme. I have to say I'm quite impressed at the way that Boots have come out and with a big advertising for their vaccination starting 17th of September. And I just wonder how quickly we're coming out with it, because I think it's actually, well, I can see how key it is to the whole thing for the winter. So that would be my first. And bearing in mind that certain, that now that there's an increase in who can have it as well. So will there be enough, and so on. Then I attended a workshop this afternoon on COVID-19 community champions, and just interested to see how they will fit in within your perspective and trying to get things rolled out and use. I can see a great use for this in terms of acting as a voice through. Some of us are already NHS volunteers, but this could be quite useful through. So I just wanted to get your take on that. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So on the flu, we are in the process of mobilising this now. So we're in detailed discussions with the practices around where access to flu vaccines will be provided, how they will be getting the throughput. I mean, we're talking for our large practices, we're talking in excess of 10,000 people needing to be vaccinated. Vaccines are on order. And will be coming into practices very soon, and across South West London we'll be supporting this with some advertising campaigns, some targeted advertising campaigns. Clearly these do need to be targeted. We need to do what we know is effective, because it's important that we only spend this money where it's appropriate to do so. But yes, we have every intention of getting on the front foot. If people get their vaccine from a number of different sources, then that's absolutely fine, but we will be really actively promoting the GP-led provision very shortly, and through a number of channels as well. So yes, so thank you for highlighting that. The Community Champions has been a massive success in Merton. So in the height of the pandemic, we had volunteers ferrying pulse oximeters. So these are devices that measure your blood oxygen levels out to people that we were monitoring, but didn't need to be admitted into hospital, who had COVID. And volunteers were sort of taking these things out into the local communities from practices, getting them back. Hugely integrated with practices. What allowed us to do that was the infrastructure that we've put in place around social prescribing in Merton over the last 3 years. It is one of the strongest, I think, anywhere really, and our clinical lead for social prescribing, Dr. Mohan Sekaram, is now a sort of nationally recognised leader in this field. So I think that what we are looking at doing is looking to see how we can use community champions in line with social prescribing to be part of our social prescribing networks, to provide a link between local practices and local networks of practices and community groups in their areas. And also there's a community subgroup being set up at the Health and Wellbeing Board, and that is going to help inform some of our work around inequalities, and specifically there are opportunities coming up to bid for charitable money around tackling inequalities, and we've identified that we will use that community subgroup to help inform some of the things that we agreed to take forwards. We've also just recently won £50,000 of charitable funding to take forward a scheme of remote intervention in diabetes, so a diabetes program but run online with people who are at high risk for COVID second wave, our diabetes Decathlon program, and that's something that we're doing across Merton and Wandsworth with a number of community groups. So I think that we have a number of irons in the fire. I think the strength that we have is around social prescribing, and around the fact that Merton Voluntary Services Council are so intrinsically involved with our social prescribing offer. It means that actually all the time, I think we're strengthening the link between our community sector and GPs. And just to say that another thing that I think should contribute towards this is that when we had the changeover in the CCGs at the start of the year, we took the former Sutton and Merton Charitable Trust, and the Merton portion of that trust has been lodged with Merton Giving, specifically to support some of that community capacity development that links into NHS services as well. So yeah, I mean that's just it's a slightly rambling answer because there's a lot going on in this area, but I think that social prescribing infrastructure is how we make sure that there's a shift in the approach, and that we bring community voices much more into the mainstream of how we provide NHS services.
Thank you.
Well, can I thank Una for her voluntary activities in the community? I think it's important that we acknowledge that, and the work that you do, along with many other people in our community. I'd also like to say that there are other pharmacies apart from Boots. I don't know if you're a shareholder, but I think James said there were other sources of the jab.
Well, my point there was, though, Chair, there was the Boots of the one that's been
She said it again.
into my inbox. Yeah, but it's in my inbox. I don't see, you know, that was really my point. It's not necessarily that I wanted in my inbox. I'm just saying they're on the front foot.
And I would say there's a balance for us, isn't there, within the public sector? I mean, Boots have, you know, fairly deep pockets, it's fair to say, in terms of the marketing department compared to the NHS. So, you know, we do want to promote the NHS sources of the vaccine, but we need to do it in a responsible and targeted way.
So, are there any other questions from members? Nigel.
No, thank you. Thank you, Chair. I would like to know how far away are you with the backlog of the patients with cancer or other treatments, and how far away are you, and what are your backup plans if there's second wave comes along? Thank you.
Sure. So just in terms of what we're targeting across the NHS in terms of reverting to previous activity levels so that we can tackle that backlog, our aim within the NHS for most services is to get to 90% of historical activity levels by the end of the calendar year. And that's what we're targeting. We have specific capacity plans in place on cancer pathways that we're working with Will Marston Partners colleagues around in order to set trajectories for getting that backlog down. And I'm happy to share some sort of specific information around what our trajectories are when they are confirmed, because that work is still underway at the moment. But suffice to say that we're putting all relevant efforts into it, but I'm happy to supply that information after the meeting. In terms of the what happens in terms of the contingency plans for the second wave, this is where I think the learning from the first wave is about what are our options to maintain some surgical capacity of various kinds if we have to go back into COVID mode. And that's where we are looking at, you know, how would we use the independent sector again in the future? How would we use hospitals that have got really clearly delineated different bits? So one of the virtues of St George's is that it has what's called the Atkinson Morley wing, which is where the neurosurgery and cardiac services are at the end of the site, and that has got a separate entrance. It's got its own theatres, it's got its own wards, so it can be treated as relatively separate. And part of our planning is around how Atkinson Morley can be used to continue some of those elective services if the rest of St George's needs to be more COVID focused as part of the second wave. In a first wave, you know, we ended up with COVID patients right the way through St George's, and if a wave was very large, that might happen again. I mean, you can't have limitless contingencies, but we do have a better understanding of how we might separate services. We are also looking at how sites such as Queen Mary's Hospital might get used as well in terms of responding to a second wave. So there are more contingencies this time because we have an understanding of the different levels we might need to go through, and we have that parallel focus, which is, you know, we need to maintain elective services, we need to maintain that throughput, because we understand that there are parallel impacts for non-COVID patients as well as for COVID patients. So that is there. I am happy to get some data circulated in terms of those trajectories around cancer recovery once they're available.
Thank you. Any other
Thank
questions?
you.
Jennifer, can I see if there's anyone else before I give you a second chance? I'll see if there's anyone that wants a first. Any takers? I've got some questions, but I'm happy for you to go next, Jennifer. Off you go, ask your second.
Thank you, Peter. Yes, just about rehabilitation, you said about St George's using that. Is it the case that it may be that we need a rehabilitation centre for the long-term ill effects of patients? Would that be something that would be being considered at all?
Probably not. In terms of a physical centre, for the reason that most patients will need a combination of visits into existing facilities and infrastructure that are provided, along with home-based therapy and therapy in other settings. So it is unlikely that we would create a physical centre to do that in this context. We are looking at whether there are certain categories of patients who, so some COVID patients were admitted into community type beds as part of their rehabilitation, and we provided those community bedded services where that was appropriate for those patients. But it's unlikely that we would sort of stand up a centre. Not least because although those patients might have had COVID, we are unclear about what the evidence is in terms of reinfection risk. And so one of the things we're trying to avoid doing is sort of putting people with vulnerabilities sort of who might be at risk of infection or cross-infection sort of in specific places together. So it would be unlikely to be a physical centre. What I think you will see is the models of COVID rehabilitation will evolve and there'll be much more of an accepted standard. I think that St George's have gone quite a long way towards sort of setting the standard in terms of they've been doing very proactive follow-up with their patients. But I think it's fair to say that, at the moment that probably is something that's quite different from place to place, and it's something that the NHS is still evolving.
Anyone with any further questions? Okay, well, if I can, I've got one or two myself. I was interested, James, in your description of the way things have changed, and the introduction of command and control. I think the last person to try that was Joseph Stalin. But what does concern me is that whilst I'm sure you'll be delighted and happy to be working for Matt Hancock, at what point will control be handed back to local health authorities?
So I think that's a phased process. I mean, there are aspects of control that have already been handed back. So we have more discretion now to make decisions about, for example, how we restart services and which services we restart, to implement local guidance. But there are still some elements where there is a very high level of regional and national coordination. So I can't predict when some of those sort of emergency legal provisions that have been put in place might finally sort of all be unwound. I think it will not be at a particular date that we say we move from a COVID pandemic regime to a non-COVID regime. I think it will be progressively stepped up over a period of time, and that more and more of that local control will revert. And in particular, what the NHS is very clear about is that the provisions that apply to sort of any long-term service changes in terms of our duties to involve people and to consult still continue to apply. So, the things that we've done as part of COVID and the things that we're doing as part of recovery, they're things that we're doing because we need to do them right now. But actually, there is, I think it's recognised within the NHS that there is a need to go back and make sure that we do have those local conversations where there might be, there might be learning that we want to take forward in terms of how we organise services in the longer term. So I don't think it'll be a big bang. It is coming back to us, but right now it still feels quite different.
Mm-hmm. Because I'm conscious that today we've seen a situation where a decision taken at the centre was challenged by local authorities in Bolton and Trafford. And I think what's been demonstrated is that it is important that local people make decisions about local health and not from a distance of 200 miles away. The next question I've got is finance, and I'd like to know how much additional expenditure you have incurred as a result of COVID-19 and what extra provision of funding has been made available. Have you been given the extra money that you've spent effectively?
Yeah, so I don't have a precise figure to hand for Merton. I can try and find it while I'm on the call, but
well, you can give it for the whole of Southwest London. I mean, you can come back to me with Merton, but
yeah, so I don't have that figure right to hand either. I mean, we have been logging our Merton specific COVID spend that's been over and above what we would normally have spent, and we've been fully reimbursed by the centre for that. So there's no penalty to local budgets for money that's needed to be spent on COVID. The principle on which we have worked is that, you know, we have made the financial commitments required to deliver safe and effective local services, and in particular to deliver on the things that we've been instructed or guided to do by the centre, and we've gone ahead and done it. The normal financial regime for the NHS has effectively been suspended during COVID. And so therefore what we've done is basically there was a national agreement on contracts with NHS providers at the start of the year, where we had contracts with third parties. We basically extended or rolled over those contracts so that we weren't doing contractual negotiations and we could sort of keep the system moving. As I say, then where systems have incurred excess cost, there's been a system of reclaim from central government for that, and that has included where often we've picked up, for example, some of the costs around getting people out of hospital that have operated on a without prejudice basis, because the statutory framework around health and care costs was suspended. So yeah, I mean there's no penalty to the local system, and the normal rules of NHS finance have effectively been suspended, certainly for this financial year to date, and we are awaiting further information from the centre about the financial rules that will apply for the second half of the year.
Okay, well, I would be grateful if you could actually confirm how much extra spending there's been and the total reimbursement from the centre, and if you can circulate that to, if you can let Stella have it, we can circulate that to the other members of the panel. My next question is, you mentioned that you were involved in making some extra provision at St George's, and what struck me is, why St George's?
So I personally, I think the provision we talked about was around ITU. Is it in reference to ITU? So there was extra ITU provision made at all 4 of the South West London acute hospitals during the COVID pandemic, and all 4 of them, and Epsom as well, as part of the Epsom St Helier Trust, increased their capacity for ITU as required during the pandemic. The reason that capacity is being looked at in the medium term around St George's in particular is that St George's, as the tertiary provider, has the greater existing concentration of ITU beds, so is better placed to act as a hub for the sector in terms of ITU provision. And you know, if you think about the way that we changed the operating model of ITU during the pandemic, it meant that you had a sort of pandemic model in terms of workforce and staffing, which stretched your ITU staffing and drew in staff from other parts of the hospital in order to maximise capacity. The more beds you have as a baseline, the more you are able to stretch your pandemic capacity as well. So by making sure that we've got that centre, we're able to make sure that we've got the future capacity for a second wave or something similar that happens. So it's not to say there was a concentration on St George's, and that was the only place that we increased ITU capacity. But it is fair to recognise that within every sector nationally, that the tertiary hospitals did act as a hub around ITU, as a point of coordination, and were often the places where it proved easiest to increase capacity rapidly in a pandemic situation. So there's something about making sure that we're able to support the plan for future surge. And indeed, one of the innovations that we put in place during COVID was based at St George's. There was a critical care retrieval service that operated across South West London, and was able to move patients between critical care services, in particular if they needed very, very specialised support that, say, only St George's could do, or if there was a simple capacity issue, which some ITUs got close to being full. Then we were also able to provide a specialist ITU ambulance to move people around.
Okay, thank you. And the final question from me is, how did COVID affect Black and minority ethnic communities, and what lessons have you already learned, and what plans do you have to address this issue going forward?
So the information that we have tells us that Black and minority ethnic communities were disproportionately affected during COVID, both in terms of hospital admissions and sadly in terms of deaths as well. And we see that in Merton, and we also see that in many other communities in South West London and nationally. We are in a process of understanding some of the factors that contributed to that. We know that there are clinical and physiological risk factors. We know that there are issues in terms of prevalence of long-term conditions, and we know that there are socioeconomic factors as well. In terms of the immediate learning we're doing, it's been really important to understand what the most immediate risk factors are, and what we can address about those risk factors in a very short term. And that's why a lot of the focus of our work has been building on the work we were already doing, particularly around diabetes, but also other long-term conditions, working with general practice and working with community groups to identify people who are at greatest vulnerability. So practices have been doing searches of their patient registers to identify people who may, for example, have type 2 diabetes and may need some support with controlling their blood sugar, because we know that this is a specific risk factor, and proactively contacting those patients to review them and to make sure that they have all the required support that they need in terms of managing their own health. So I think that the most immediate learning is to understand the risk factors, particularly understand the modifiable risk factors, and to make sure that we're being really proactive with our intervention, and to make sure that we're supporting people who are at risk within those communities as well as possible. I think that the reflection that we have had as health and care partners in both of the boroughs that I support, and this is why I think the community subgroup that's been set up by Dagmar to support the health and wellbeing is really important, is that as statutory bodies we can only go so far. So we can, we have a number of tools at our disposal, but actually I think there is more that we can do to work really proactively with communities, both as the CCG and also through our primary care networks or our local GPs, to make sure that we are offering support that that works for local communities. Pre-COVID in Wandsworth, actually, we had piloted a model of community-led health clinics. So we were doing health checks in churches and mosques and temples in the south of Wandsworth, and we're identifying a number of people with long-term conditions who possibly weren't accessing GP care, and actually supporting those people to access services. So although we wouldn't do that at the moment because it wouldn't exactly be something we could do in the context of social distancing, there are opportunities for us to use similar models, and we're exploring how we do that aligned with a more proactive approach from primary and community care to make sure that we're identifying the people who are at greatest risk. So I think that those are some of the immediate points of learning. Nationally, the NHS has indicated that as part of this next phase of recovery, it will be paying much more attention to how services restart and to ensuring that the restart of services doesn't actually widen health inequalities. So for us locally, this means, we need to be actively working on, who is accessing restarted services, to make sure that we are identifying any potential inequalities, challenges that are arising from that. And for example, in the way that, we're providing digital services, making sure that we're identifying people who may not be able to access digital services and making sure that they have other forms of access. So I think there's an immediate local response, but there is basically the NHS nationally is now making this a matter of performance and accountability for local systems as well.
So does that mean that there might be a rethink on the siting of the A&E and maternity services at St Helier Hospital, which serves a deprived community with higher concentrations of minority ethnic communities compared to the proposed new site, which is in a more affluent area?
So I think the issues relating to COVID and the impact of COVID and the impact on the decision for the location of the Specialist Emergency Care Hospital under IHT were well rehearsed and presented to the committees in common of the governing bodies when the decision was made in July. So I think that issue has already been rehearsed, Councillor, and I am not intending to go into it further here.
Okay. Any other questions from any other members? Pauline.
It's not exactly a question, it's just that I found it very difficult to follow Mr. Blythe's statements all the time. So if that's my fault, then I'm very sorry. But I did honestly find it difficult because he made his statements to begin with so long, and to be honest, I was almost falling asleep by then. So if he'd just make his comments a little bit shorter and more precise, I would be very grateful.
Thank you, Councillor, and I'll bear that in mind for future presentations.
Okay, can I just ask, we've got Councillor Mark Allison with us, and I wondered if he would like to share with the committee the current situation about finance in terms of Merton's expenditure on COVID-19, because you've explained what's happening within the NHS, and when I last heard what the situation was in respect of the local authorities' additional expenditure, it was very different to what you've just reported. Mark.
Thank you, Chair. I don't actually have the figures to hand, but the council has spent tens of millions of pounds in its response to COVID in the various ways. So not just about providing direct assistance to people, but also the additional costs that are falling on the council because people aren't using our services, the leisure centres, the parking spaces, and things like that. So we're very significantly out of pocket as a result, and that's likely to lead, unless the government comes forward with any further assistance for the council, to further cuts next year of many millions of pounds. And obviously that's going to affect the way that we respond to health issues as well. So we'll be relying on the local health service to step in and help us, because we will not have the resourcing in future. We need to make probably record amount of cuts for a next year. Full information will be published in time for the Cabinet next week, where we'll be able to give Council a proper update. But I apologise, the figures are kind of like changing every day, and I don't want to preempt by sort of giving you anything that might have changed by tomorrow.
Well, I did spring that on you, but it just struck me that you know, if there was some way that we could claim the money through the NHS, who seem to be getting whatever's required, then that would be very handy.
I think you've alighted on something there. The different ways that the health service and local authorities have been treated is very telling. That the local health service deficits have been effectively wiped out, but the deficits that the councils are being forced to run as a result of COVID, we're not being covered for those. I think that by the looks of things, John Morgan wants to add something.
I mean, I don't have the exact details for numbers, but in my presentation, I will be able to touch on some of the money that we've been able to claim from health for COVID expenditure and adult social care. So I can't give you the details, but in my presentation, I will touch on the fact that we are able to claim substantial sums of money for care packages and COVID-related expenses through the CCG and to the NHS.
Well, we look forward to that.
If I may just come back in, Councillor, so probably 2 points on that. The first is that we are very cognizant in the NHS of the situation in local authorities of the challenges around the money. And as John says, we have made all possible funding available. So, for example, where there are costs that could fall to health or to local government around discharge, we have, wherever possible, sought to use the guidance to take those through the NHS in line with guidance, because we are aware of the challenges for our local authority partners. And just reverting to a previous point, I can confirm that the Merton and Wandsworth specific costs relating to excess COVID expenditure were £4.5 million to the end of July, from April to the end of July. That excludes, however, additional reclaims made by NHS providers, principally hospitals, for additional COVID costs. But the borough-specific costs for the CCG for Merton and Wandsworth for £4.5 million to the end of July.
And you've had all that back, have you?
Yeah, so we've reclaimed that, yeah.
Good. Okay. Well, I'm pleased to hear that you've had it back, because I think that's only right and proper. And I'm pleased to hear that you are doing what you can to assist John and his colleagues wherever possible. And I thank you for that. So I think, unless there are any further questions, we will move on to item 5, which is commissioning arrangements in South West London, where we're going to get another verbal update from James. And if you could keep your remarks brief, I'd be grateful. Introductory remarks, so we can have lots of questions.
Yes, so the CCG merger took place on the 1st of April 2020. So this was the merger of Merton and 5 other CCGs in South West London into a single South West London CCG. That has taken place. We have put in place the decision-making structures that we committed to. So we have a borough committee for Merton, and additionally, that members of that borough committee meet with other health and care partners in the borough through a group called Merton Health and Care Together, which has been the main forum for agreeing our response to the COVID pandemic and to recovery from the pandemic. So we have implemented the change. We have implemented it in the way that we said we would. The chair of Merton Borough Committee is Dr. Vasagana Pragasan, and the deputy chair is Dr. Karen Worthington, both of whom will, I think, be known to many councillors from the partnership work that they've done in the borough in the past. So I'm happy to stop there, councillor, and take any questions.
Okay, are there any questions on the new arrangements?
Yes.
Wow. So everyone's happy. Good. Okay. Well, thank you for that. That really was very brief. We'll move on then to item 6. I mean, presumably James, if people have queries, they can direct them to you, and you can find the right person during the period where things are settling down. Is that fair?
I am happy to pick up any queries from councillors at any point, and I will get a response or direct them to the right person. That's fine.
That's very kind. Thank you. And
Thank
so
you, councillor.
we move on to item 6, which is the update on COVID-19 from Merton Community and Housing Department. And is that, John, your chance to shine?
Well, hopefully. And of course, we've got Dagmar here as well, who will help answer some of the technical questions as we go along.
Okay, and if you could both keep your remarks brief, because we can't have different rules for our partners from the NHS to our own staff.
Please keep me to time, Chair. So I won't take you through the paper in verbatim because you've had a chance to read it. So I'll try and pick out the key points from the paper and leave some time for questions at the end. So at the start of the pandemic, our main focus was around our hospitals. We had very clear guidance that there would be a surge within our hospitals of people being admitted with COVID, and that we, of course, would have to discharge people, a higher number of people, to enable people still to be able to flow into the hospital and receive the treatment that they needed. We got very, very clear numbers of expected COVID discharges from hospitals from the NHS. It was broken down into 4 pathways that we had to prepare for. Pathway 0 would be people leaving hospital with no care needs. Pathway 1 was the numbers of people leaving hospital that would need to go home with a care package. And again, we got weekly numbers building to a peak and then starting to decline again as the peak started to subside. Pathway 2 was really a health one, and those were the numbers of people that would be going for specialist rehab and a specialist rehab unit before they could go home. In pathway 3, the numbers of people that would be discharged into residential and nursing. Now, there is complexity within this because we were also told that we would have a reduction in our staff due to COVID. So we had to make our plans based on the fact that we would have 20 to 30% less staff at any one time due to COVID across the system. So that would be the staff, the volunteers, the carers, our social workers, all of our staff. We were predicting that we would have less staff. So we had to work with our providers, with our home care providers, with our nursing providers, with our teams, ensuring that we had the capacity. So for our social work teams and our reablement team to discharge people and places for them to go, so that we had home care and we had residential and nursing homes as well for people to go. Now, the important thing is, which we touched on earlier on, at the start of the pandemic as well, the NHS was very clear that pathway 1, people being discharged from hospital into home care. Pathway 3, those are the ones that normally the local authority would fund, would be fully funded by the NHS. So anyone discharged from hospital on pathway 1 and pathway 3 is fully funded by the NHS. That was from the start of the pandemic in March up until the 1st of September. We are now in a transition period. So those people that were funded by the NHS are now, we need to reassess, and we'll have the next few months to start reassessing those people to transition them back into local authority funding. So those pathway 1 and pathway 3 were fully funded by the NHS. The NHS also nationally, this is that top down that we were speaking about earlier on, agreed that any COVID expenditure on other care packages, so if we had people in the community that needed very specific care due to COVID, perhaps they couldn't go back to their own home and they needed to go somewhere else, or they needed extra care because their carer was ill for COVID, we could claim for that as well. Now, I don't have the exact numbers of that with me, and I cannot give it to you just now, and but I'll be able to give it to you at some point, because we're still in the pandemic and we're still collating those numbers to claim back to the NHS. Now, part of our planning is we are now planning for the next surge. In the next surge, I won't take you through in detail because James has already said it, might be slightly more complex for us because we're approaching the winter season. So the winter season, you have the normal flu, plus you've got the COVID-19, plus you've got the pent-up demand for hospitals with less people going to hospital due to COVID. So we are starting the modelling and the planning with our NHS partners, with health, with the voluntary sector, with our home care and nursing providers, so that we are prepared to be able to meet the next expected surge. And that planning is well underway. Now, at the start of the pandemic, one of the groups that we knew would be most affected were our elderly and vulnerable people in care homes. So one of the first tasks that we had was around personal protective equipment. I won't go into details, but you will all know that there was a worldwide shortage, a national shortage, a London shortage, a local shortage of PPE. We worked with our corporate procurement team and our commissioning team, our procurement team for in the council, to really speedily get as much PPE into the borough as possible so that we were able to support our nursing homes, our residential homes, and our home care providers, because it was very important, and of course our own staff as well. It was key that we had that PPE to protect staff and to protect cross-contamination and limit contamination in residential nursing homes and from our home care providers. And you see from the details that I've provided that Merton provided over 2 million pieces of PPE to our providers. 900,000 pieces directly went to our 38 nursing and residential homes so that they had adequate stocks of PPE throughout the pandemic. Another thing at the start of the pandemic, we knew that care homes would need some extra support. And with Dagmar, our Director of Public Health, we set up a care home support team. That team was linked with adult social care, public health, our community nursing provider, and with our CCG to provide a rapid response team to go in to a home that had a pandemic to provide extra support to people that had COVID. Also to provide training to all of our home and care home staff on infection control, to make sure that people were using PPE appropriately and to limit cross-infection. The team were also set up to assist with track and trace, with testing, with general advice to our 38 care homes in the borough. Sadly, we had 38 direct deaths related to COVID from COVID-19, but thanks to the work that we did, those numbers were lower than they could have been, thanks to the work of Dagmar and our team and our sourcing of PPE. Another area at the start of the pandemic we had to grapple with very quickly was those people who were clinically extremely vulnerable. There were about, at the start of the pandemic, it was about 2 million, and that raised across England, that raised to about 4 million as the pandemic went on, and we had 7,200 people. So that group of people, due to their health conditions, were asked to shield for up to 12 weeks. That was at the start of the pandemic, to shield for up to 12 weeks to protect themselves and to protect the NHS from extra people going into hospital. We had to very speedily set up a wraparound service for those people. And as some council services were closing, so our leisure centres, our libraries, bailiffs, and a number of other departments, we moved those staff to our shielding hub to start to provide support to those shielding. And that was about 60 staff that we moved to shielding. The government set up a national service so that food could be delivered to those people shielding that needed it. But we had to provide the wraparound service to those people that were shielding. And that could include linking with pharmacists to ensure they got medication, to helping them walk their dog, giving support, giving extra specialist support around toiletries, around specific foods that people needed. So we provided that wraparound service. Shielding paused on the 31st of July. It's paused, but we have the means to reinstate that if we go into a lockdown or a local lockdown and shielding was reinstated, we would have to provide that wraparound service again. Another area that I was going to touch on was the impact on the BAME community. I won't dwell on it because James, I think, answered it very clearly in his previous response, but I will speak a little bit about some of the support that we've given to staff returning to work. So we have, of course, got a BME a staff group, and all staff returning to work have had specific risk assessments. People with shielding and BME communities have had a more specialist risk assessment and support put in place to support them returning to work. The council has also set up a Bame Forum where BME staff are able to raise issues and look at support to get more BME staff into more senior roles within the council. I then wanted to just touch on some of the work that we're planning for the future. But before I did that, I just wanted to thank some of the work that we've done with the NHS over the last, since the start of the pandemic. This has been a really difficult time for everyone, for officers, for residents, for everyone that's been impacted on this. And we would not, adult social care would not have managed the work that we've done without the support of the council staff, without the NHS, without carers and the support that they've given to loved ones when some of our services stopped. And I just wanted to mention those ones particularly.
Is James still with us or has he gone?
No, he's left.
Right.
He's left.
Okay, it's a shame that he didn't hear this. Perhaps you should record it and send it off to him tomorrow.
I'll tell him
cheer him up.
I'll tell him myself. Now, normally during a crisis, the crisis is ongoing. We then normally, during the crisis, you normally start to prepare for the recovery. This pandemic has been slightly different. So the first surge is finished, and normally that would be the end. You would start recovery to get back to normal. It isn't like this with this pandemic, because the first surge is finished. We're now in a recovery, but we're also planning for the next surge. So some council services have reopened, but not all. So at the start of the pandemic, in line with government guidance, we had to close our libraries. Those libraries have now reopened, but not fully, because we cannot open them fully because we've got to maintain social distancing. We've got a regime in place to clean books, etc. But we've started up the libraries for limited browsing and for click and collect. Our day centres also had to close. We've got 4 Borough Day Centers. 3 of them closed. 1 of them remained open for a small limited number of people with very complex learning disability. We now have 2 complex day centres open for learning disability, meeting the needs of very complex people. And we're not in a position yet to reopen. We cannot reopen because we can't have mass gatherings in our day centres, and we've got to maintain social distancing. But we need to meet the needs of our clients. So we've opened up 2 day centres for limited usage for a small cohort, and we've also initiated our day centre staff are going to people's homes, taking people out. providing much more bespoke respite and relief for some of our carers. Our council offices have reopened, but again, opened limits so that we can do face-to-face for housing, people coming up for housing applications. We never stopped doing face-to-face assessments. We didn't stop doing those face-to-face assessments, but we did, use other means of engaging with our residents as well, and that could be Zoom and other means. And we want to continue with some of those because some of them have been extremely useful. And an example of that could be occupational therapy. Occupational therapy do their face-to-face assessment. Then they were able to utilize new means of technology to give extra training to family members on how to use equipment, to watch how people use their equipment. So we want to maintain that. I haven't got much else I wanted to cover, except I just wanted to very quickly speak about the community hub. At the start of the pandemic, we worked very closely with our community, voluntary sector, and we set up a community hub alongside our shielding hub. The community hub was the place where our residents, any resident that was worried about COVID or needed some extra support, would be able to call in directly to the voluntary sector, and they were able to signpost people into the council for extra support or around into the voluntary sector. We've continued with that model, and we're planning to continue with that model to the 31st of March at least. But moving forward, we think that might be a good model that we utilize as a preventative means and to link in better to the voluntary sector and into the PCNs and social prescribing, which James mentioned earlier on. Now, I haven't mentioned track and trace and issues around track and trace, but Dagmar, if she would like, might want to come in and say something around that, or else you might have some questions at the end. But that's all from me.
Thank you, John. Dagmar.
Hi, I think you've listened quite a long time. So if there are specific questions around the contact tracing, I just tell you very, very briefly. As you're aware, local authorities have a duty to have local outbreak control plans. We've got one, it's on the Merton website. And what it means is one very important part is surveillance. So on a daily basis, we study how many cases we have in Merton, how many contacts are traced. And we work very closely in our sub-region and at London level, so that any control measures are really coordinated. The most important work, and where I'm engaging all of you, is to bring the community, the voluntary sector, the Chamber of Commerce, our businesses with us. So that means we have developed what we call a weekly situational awareness report, a bit of a mouthful, but it's an overview of how we are doing on a weekly basis. And we are distributing this widely with our partners. We share it with our partners. We share it with our Borough Resilience Forum. We share it with our Health and Wellbeing Board and our community subgroup, so that we're all well prepared, because nobody has a crystal ball. And as John and James said, we have to be planning for the worst, which means more outbreaks and potentially a second wave. That's all I want to add at the moment.
Well, can I just ask, how is our track and trace doing by comparison with the national and London situation, Dagmar?
Yeah, so I wouldn't say it is our track and trace, because at the moment it is a national, it's the NHS TT service, test and trace service. You will have heard in the national press and as well in discussions at London level that there is the movement to move some of the contact tracing into local authorities, and in particular when the national service has difficulties in finding the cases, because that's obviously the starting point for your contact tracing. Then after 24 hours, if they have not had any luck, they want help from local authorities. That is at the moment planned to be rolled out in London in a staged way. And we in Merton, like other local authorities in London, are preparing for that. But at the moment, we are in our contact tracing is done by NHS TT.
Okay, sorry, I apologise. I thought that what you're describing was already underway, Dagmar, hence my question. Okay, any other questions for John or Dagmar? Una.
Hi, thank you very much for that. I think that's been incredibly detailed, and I thank you. I've got actually on my phone the new NHS Test and Trace app, which I'm supposedly testing, but luckily haven't had symptoms to test. But I'm just keen to know when we're likely to be able to roll this out and how effective you see that being locally, because you've touched on it, but I'm just interested about it all. The reason I've got it on mine is I'm one of the NHS responders, and we were invited to take part. I think there's one other London borough, Newham, I think, is going to be taking part, and someone else. But it does seem a while coming. I mean, I don't know really. I haven't really been given any more notice as to where we are with it. So interested to get your perspective.
Shall I come in, Chair?
Yes, please.
So you're not the only one, Una. It is not very well shared or discussed. And I know as much as you that we're waiting for the findings of the pilot in Newham. There have been hiccups, and the effectiveness and the acceptability of apps not only in the UK but elsewhere is not completely straightforward. And so what the aim is of the pilot to really understand what and how it can complement the rest of the NHS track and trace. The idea that the app is the miracle has not really materialized, but people are confident that it complements and is part and parcel of the whole system.
Yeah.
So bit of a Weasley answer, I'm afraid.
Yeah, it would just be, I mean, I can see it being really good because it's got the QR code thing on it. And I think, it is the way to go if we want to start to get out of and into a new normality. And so I just find it rather sad that we seem to be not moving forward terribly fast with it, really. And that's all. I mean, maybe you could somehow feed that back, but I'm sure it could be good. But just, it just seems a bit disappointing if we're just a bit stuck with it, really. But
okay, thank you, Una. Mary.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Chair. I would like to thank Dagmar and John and the team for their update on their work in the pandemic. But I have noticed in Morden and sometimes around Sutton, but in most of the large stores, there are now fewer and fewer people wearing face masks. And I was wondering if perhaps somebody could approach these stores. And I know some people can't, but there's too many people now that, it can't be just because of sort of one thing or another, but there's a lot of people now who has dismissed the mask. So I was wondering if we could do some sort of a program to sort of re-educate them about wearing the mask.
Dagmar?
That was one.
Yeah. So
that was one.
Shall I wait then? Mary, do you want to say the other
Yeah,
one
and
first?
the other thing, yeah, and my other query was to John, knowing the terrible effect this has had on the older people in the borough, and especially speaking now about friends in St. Helier, even though we visit them and do the shopping for them and that, but really is having a very depressing effect on them, and a lot of people are very depressed. So I was wondering if in a limited way we could get people into groups again. Thank you.
Dagmar, do you want to respond to the first question?
Yeah, so with the regards to observation that some of the retail doesn't really adherence to face coverings is not happening. I will pass that on to my EHO colleagues, so environmental health officers who have responsibility for workplaces, and we'll see what we can do. I will also liaise with the Chamber of Commerce because these are two different routes, some more regulatory, some more promotional, and hopefully that will convince people. I think all of us in a way also have a really important role to be role models. Sometimes we all forget, but that we also really stand out to point it out. I always carry some spare because sometimes people just forget to have a face mask. So we can all do our little bit as well to make it more of a norm. But I will pick it up with my council colleagues.
John?
Thank you. At one stage, you weren't allowed into the store without a mask, but that seems to have disappeared now. They have nobody on the door.
John?
A good point raised, Mary. People's lives have been thrown about. Our lunch clubs have closed, our day centres have closed, and people's lives have been upended. So for people currently attending our day centres, the people that were attending our day centres, Andy Ottaway's sales team, our head of provider services, have been contacting people, have been ensuring that those people have the support that they need, and we have been providing other means of support, whether it's respite, offering direct payments so that they commission themselves, other things themselves, and of course setting up small groups for people. So that is currently enacted for our current client group. We've been working with our mental health colleagues as well, because there are more people, not just older people, but there's a higher number of people suffering from depression during the pandemic. So we're currently working with our mental health colleagues because they're also surge planning as well. So primary care, and with our specialist mental health colleagues, planning for a surge in people presenting with mental health problems. So that work is ongoing just now. The good thing is that we are reopening a little bit. So people are able to go out now, people are able to go shopping, people are able to do things. But day centres, lunch clubs, those kind of things cannot be reopened yet. And we have to be very careful to maintain that social distancing. People that are older, people that have got diabetes or complex health problems, they are more impacted. But the guidance from the government is still that people are shielding, people that are in high risk groups do sort of maintain a social distance and do maintain, are much more careful when they go out. And that isn't going to change for the foreseeable future, I don't think.
John, can I ask on that point, is there some specific guidance about day centres? And if that should change, could you alert Mary and her group? Because I do take the point she's making about the isolation of people, and there's a balance to be had, isn't there, between the detrimental impact on mental health versus the very real threat of the virus itself. And you know, these are all judgments that have to be made. But firstly, if there is some guidance, can you let Mary have it? And could you agree to inform her if and when that is relaxed and changed so that she can start to provide the service at the earliest opportunity.
That would be a definite, but I mean, I've got to caution as well, because the groups that we're speaking about are the people that would be most affected by the pandemic. If we wholesale opened our day centre for people with dementia, we wouldn't be able to maintain social distancing. Transport would be an issue. We couldn't transport people in groups to the day centre and transport them home. Once they were in the day centre, we wouldn't be able to maintain social distancing. That just wouldn't be possible. And we couldn't be forcibly pulling people away from each other and steering people away from each other. The better option at the moment is to provide the services and the extra support in people's homes if it's in their own best interest. But when the guidance changed, of course, we would share it with the lunch clubs. Mary, you know, there's nothing more I would like than open up those lunch clubs again, because I think they're fantastic. A fantastic place for people to meet.
I know.
You know that very well.
Okay, Joan, you've got a question.
Yes.
Thank you, Chair. And I would like to say thank you both for your report, and thank every single person in their community for all the support that they have been given through this difficult time. And this question either for John or Dagmar. I know it's a very difficult time, and I know the GP practice and pharmacists have been going through, you know, lots of stress and strain, but I have been getting quite a lot of complaint and also experience for myself. People who are recovering from whatever surgery or illness they may have in home, and they're trying to get in touch with GP, their telephone, you know, no, you know, they phone, no response. Last week, Thursday, I was going out in my area and I saw this woman. She looked really in, you know, depressed mood, and she is a cancer patient just going through recovery. And she dropped her prescription to the optician of the the pharmacist, because she ran out of medication, and they told her to return. That was Thursday, to return on the Tuesday. And she said, I told him I haven't got no medication. I all run out because I've been trying to get through to my doctor. And anyway, cut story short, I went back with her and I explained to the pharmacist, and there and then they had the medication there and she was getting things like those. We need to look into. And, you know, because that was a great stress for her. A matter of fact, we could have lost her by going home without, you know, having the proper medication. She have to wait for, you know, a week, you know, to get what she needs. And I don't know if that come under your remit, but I mean, these are some of the things we need to look into and see how we can support, you know, people in different ways in the community. We've been doing a marvelous job, but there are some areas which need to be touched upon. Thank you.
John, do you want to answer that, or Dagmar? Who?
Dagmar would be better placed as our Director of Public Health. You're on
You need to unmute.
So, Councillor Henry, thank you for drawing the attention. I think two things how we can approach this. Obviously, if there is a concrete person who has an issue with contacting their own GP, or with the GP, the linked pharmacist, then the best thing is to get in contact with that practice and with the consent of the patient to raise it, because it's an individual patient. What I can do as well is, James is not on the line anymore, but I can alert the CCG from a more principled point of view that feedback has been that sometimes getting in touch with GPs is an issue, and sometimes getting the medicines in the pharmacy is an issue, so that the message can get around in a systematic way. What for me was quite striking, because I have been earlier in a call from the CCG, that actually the latest GP survey, you know, they have to do a mandated survey about satisfaction, patient satisfaction. For Merton, it actually has turned out generally really well, which doesn't mean that your case isn't very real, but the point I'm making is that it might be an individual case that is best followed up with that individual practice. And if you have any issues with getting in contact with the practice, you can always come back to me and I can link you up, because the CCG has a proper system if patients can't get in contact with their GPs. But it is important, obviously, that you have the consent of the patient. Does that make sense?
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
Nigel. Nigel, do you want to speak?
Right, for me, yes. Thank you, and thank you for what you're doing, which is great. However, it is possible to ask all the housing groups to show all the vulnerable people to have access by van or by whatever it is, because in the last lockdown with the flying on Hyper, I was quite shocked to find at least two people who were home bandaged, and they did not have any access to technology or whichever, and they weren't aware there were help available. Therefore, my question is to ask all the housing groups to ensure that everyone is aware there is help available, and because there are some people are so terrified to leave their flats or whatever, therefore they are completely cut out. Thank you.
It is a good point that you've raised, because not all of our clients have access to iPads, to internet, to modern technology. So one of the things that we did, very luckily at the start of the pandemic, My Merton was being published. So we did put all of the phone numbers for the hub, the shielding, how people could get support around food distribution. Food if they were having problems with food. And the next versions of My Merton as well will contain the same numbers as well. Some of the things that I didn't speak about at the start of my presentation was the support that was also given from the local community. There were about 2,000 volunteers set up a group called Mutual Aid. So people providing support to their neighbours and friends, putting flyers through people's doors. So separate from the voluntary sector, local communities setting up mutual aid as well. Now we linked very clearly with the council, with the voluntary sector, linked into mutual aid so that we could work together. But again, mutual aid was a fantastic resource, finding those hard to reach people. It's a good point that you've raised, and we will endeavour to communicate with people in other means other than iPads and phones and to keep people in the loop. Is that okay?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Dave, you've got a question.
Yes, thank you, Chair. There's been a lot of talk of the normal winter flu season coming up, the pent-up demand on the NHS coming back, and that those two combined with a potential second wave of the COVID virus. Is the information you're getting and advice you're having that we're making contingency plans in case there is a second wave, or are we fairly certain, well, we don't know the extent of it, but there will be some sort of second wave coming in the months ahead?
I mean, Dagmar sort of said it as well. We're planning for the worst. And I think that's the best thing to do. So the details that we're giving is for a worst case scenario. No one has a magic ball. We don't know what's going to happen, but we have to have the plans in place. So various things that we're started looking at as part of our planning. So we know that if someone's discharged from hospital with COVID, it isn't always the best thing for them to go back to their own home or to go back to a residential and nursing home. So we're looking with the CCG to commission hotbeds. So units that people with COVID could go to until they're better. The Southwest London, the CCG and the borough are looking at that together and separately. So we are planning for the worst. I think it's right that we do that. It's always better to be prepared for the worst. We don't have a crystal ball if there is going to be a second wave. However, from my own experience, I think this is going to be a difficult winter for us. There's plans in place for the biggest immunization for flu in records, but not everyone will take that up. We know that. Some people will refuse. I think it's going to be a busy winter for us. I've got to be honest. So while not having a crystal ball, I am planning hard.
Thank you. Jennifer.
Thank you. Yes, I'm going back toward the track and trace testing. I'm just wondering what the council are going to say. Are they going to push the government to have more authority on testing for care homes? I don't know if there's going to be testing for teachers and staff at schools. And, you know, the vulnerable groups such as people with the learning difficulties and autism. There's a large number of people there that, testing isn't available on a regular basis.
Yeah, shall I come in for that one?
Please, yes.
So you're absolutely right. The national strategy is very much to expand testing capacity. And at the moment, we are still having more demand than supply. So you make what you want out of that. Behind the scenes, absolutely lobbying and agreement in all quarters that the supply needs to be enhanced. There is work going on. What our role therefore is locally, because I'm not in charge of the supply, is that I help to prioritize. So the main priority will always be that all people who are symptomatic, even only slightly symptomatic, get their test immediately. And that, I think, we particularly got that really going in care homes, and that helped us to get a grip. You're absolutely right that there are high-risk groups that do warrant asymptomatic regular testing, and it is happening and resourced in health because that is the highest risk. And we had one round of all our care homes have had routine testing of all staff and all residents, and it is meant to be a regular occurrence, staff every week, residents every month. That has been delayed. So at the moment, we only had one round. And we have been told, and I've just come off a London meeting earlier this evening, that it is anticipated to restart next week, 7th of September. We are also working together with our NHS partners, and again, James is not here, but it is another area where I would give credit where credit is due, that we have mutual aid arrangements, because the NHS is using NHS laboratories. It's called Pillar 1 testing. And so we have mutual aid agreements. So if we are struggling with capacity and feel we have priority testing to be done, the NHS will help us. And so we are thinking about prioritising some more asymptomatic testing, particularly around some adult social care high-risk settings.
Thank you. Any other questions? Okay, well, in that case, I'd like to thank John and Dagmar for their presentations, but also answering the questions that members have on this important issue. And I think one of the things that I'm picking up from all the members of this committee is a desire for the staff that have been involved in this and the volunteers to recognise that we appreciate their efforts. And if there is some way of letting all our staff who've worked hard to protect the community at this difficult time, then I'd be very keen for you to get that message out. So thank you. And we now move on to the last item on our agenda, which is the work programme. Can we note the work programme?
Yes, noted.
Okay, well, in that case, I'd like to thank you all for your virtual attendance, for your exemplary behaviour, and for your contributions and questions. And you can please take the rest of the night off.
Thank you, Chair.
I'll declare the meeting closed.